What if I told you that in just 2 years, 1937 and 1938, the Soviet Union arrested 1.5 million of its own citizens, executed nearly 700,000 of them, and sent the rest to die slowly in the Gulag? Not enemies, not foreign spies, not counter-revolutionaries plotting Stalin's overthrow. The victims were loyal communists, revolutionary heroes, military commanders, factory workers, teachers, engineers. People who had built the Soviet state, fought for the revolution, believed in the cause with every fiber of their being. And they were destroyed by a system that demanded confessions to crimes that never happened. That tortured prisoners until they invented elaborate conspiracies. That turned the revolution into a cannibalistic machine that devoured its own children. Stalin's Great Purge wasn't war. It was state-sponsored paranoia transformed into industrial-scale murder. It was a totalitarian system discovering that its greatest enemy wasn't capitalism or fascism. It was anyone who might someday, possibly, pose a threat to Stalin's absolute control. This is the story of how a revolution meant to liberate humanity created a killing machine that murdered its own believers. How fear became policy, and how a single man's paranoia became the death sentence for 1 million people. This is the story of the Great Purge. To understand the Great Purge, we need to understand Stalin's position in the mid-1930s and the paranoia that consumed him. Stalin's consolidation of power. Joseph Stalin wasn't the inevitable leader of the Soviet Union. When Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was just one of several Bolshevik leaders competing for control. He wasn't the most brilliant theorist, that was Trotsky. He wasn't the most popular, that was Bukharin. He wasn't Lenin's chosen successor. Lenin's final testament actually warned against giving Stalin too much power. But Stalin had one skill his rivals lacked: bureaucratic manipulation. He controlled the Communist Party apparatus. He understood that real power in a revolutionary state didn't come from brilliance or popularity. It came from controlling appointments, managing information, and building networks of loyal subordinates. By 1929, Stalin had outmaneuvered all his rivals. Trotsky was in exile. Bukharin was marginalized. Zinoviev and Kamenev were politically broken. Stalin was General Secretary, a title that sounded bureaucratic, but meant he controlled the entire Soviet state. But here's Stalin's problem. He'd come to power through political maneuvering, not revolutionary legitimacy. The old Bolsheviks, the people who'd actually made the revolution, who'd fought in the Civil War, who had Lenin's personal endorsement, they'd opposed Stalin's rise. They'd compromised, submitted, accepted his leadership because the alternative was splitting the party. But Stalin knew they'd never really accepted him, and he could never trust them. The Kirov assassination, December 1st, 1934. Sergei Kirov, head of the Leningrad Communist Party, young, popular, a rising star, was shot dead in his office by a gunman named Leonid Nikolashev. The official story was that Nikolaev was a disgruntled former party member, acting alone. But within hours, Stalin had declared that Kirov's assassination was part of a vast conspiracy involving former opposition leaders, foreign intelligence services, and hidden enemies within the party. Stalin personally traveled to Leningrad to oversee the investigation. Within weeks, thousands were arrested. Show trials began. The conspiracy expanded with each interrogation. Here's what historians now believe. Stalin almost certainly ordered Kirov's murder. Kirov was too popular, too independent, a potential rival. His assassination gave Stalin the justification he needed for what came next. The Kirov assassination was the spark, but the fuel, the paranoia, the suspicion, the belief that enemies were everywhere, that had been building in Stalin's mind for years. The ideology of permanent conspiracy. Stalin developed a theoretical framework to justify what was coming. He argued that as socialism grew stronger, its enemies would become more desperate and more cunning. They would infiltrate the party. They would disguise themselves as loyal Bolsheviks while secretly working to destroy the Soviet Union. This was a brilliant psychological trick. It meant that success didn't bring security, it brought greater danger. The more the Soviet Union achieved, the more vigilant it needed to be. There was no point at which the revolution could relax, because enemies were always adapting, always hiding, and anyone could be an enemy. Your commitment to the party, your revolutionary credentials, your years of service, none of that mattered. In fact, the most dangerous enemies were those who seemed most loyal because they were the best at hiding. This logic made everyone suspect. It turned the Soviet Union into a society where trust was treason, where questioning the hunt for enemies made you an enemy, where the safest position was to denounce others before they denounced you. In 1936, Stalin was ready to begin the Great Purge. All he needed was a mechanism. The Great Purge began with spectacle. 3 massive show trials designed to demonstrate the vast conspiracies Stalin insisted existed. The Trial of the 16, August 1936. In August 1936, 16 old Bolsheviks, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, 2 of Lenin's closest associates, were put on trial in Moscow. The charges were fantastical. They had conspired with Trotsky and Nazi Germany to assassinate Soviet leaders, overthrow Stalin, and restore capitalism. The evidence was confessions. Just confessions. No documents, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Just the defendants standing in court, describing in detail their treasonous activities. And the confessions were remarkably detailed. Zinoviev and Kamenev described secret meetings that never happened. They named co-conspirators who would be arrested in future waves. They accepted full guilt, expressed remorse, and asked for death. The trial lasted 6 days. All 16 defendants were convicted and executed within hours of the verdict. But here's what made it a show trial. It wasn't about determining guilt. Everyone knew the outcome before it began. The trial was performance, a public demonstration that enemies existed, that Stalin had exposed them, and that the state was eternally vigilant. Foreign observers were confused. These weren't terrified prisoners denying charges. They were actively cooperating in their own destruction. Why? The science of breaking. What the world didn't see was what happened before the trial. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had perfected psychological torture. They didn't just beat prisoners, though they did that. They destroyed them mentally. The technique was called conveyor belt interrogation. Prisoners were interrogated continuously, day and night, by teams of interrogators working in shifts. The prisoner never slept. Questions were repeated endlessly. Inconsistencies were exploited. The interrogation continued until the prisoner was psychologically shattered. But the real genius was the offer. Confess and your family will be spared. Confess and you'll serve the party one last time by exposing the conspiracy. Confess and your death will be quick. For old Bolsheviks who'd spent their lives serving the party, this was effective. They genuinely believed they might be helping the revolution by confessing to crimes they didn't commit. They thought their false confessions would satisfy Stalin's paranoia and end the purge. They were catastrophically wrong. Their confessions were just the beginning. The Trial of the 17, January 1937. The second show trial was even more elaborate. 17 defendants, including Karl Radek, a prominent Bolshevik theorist, confessed to being part of a Trotskyist anti-Soviet center working with Germany and Japan to destroy the USSR. The charges kept escalating. Sabotage in factories, poisoning workers, planning military defeat, coordinating with foreign intelligence services. The conspiracy was now portrayed as spanning the entire country, with tentacles in every institution. 13 were executed. 4 received prison sentences, likely because Stalin needed them alive to testify at future trials. The Trial of the 21, March 1938, the third and final major show trial, was the most audacious. 21 defendants, including Nikolai Bukharin, Lenin's favorite, called the Darling of the Party, confessed to belonging to a bloc of rights and Trotskyites that had been working to destroy the Soviet Union since 1918. Think about that timeline. They were confessing to treason that began during the revolution itself. while they were fighting to create the Soviet state. The logic was insane, but that was the point. The conspiracy was so vast, so cunning, that it had been operating since the beginning. Bukharin tried to resist. His confession was partial and contradictory. He admitted to counter-revolutionary thinking, but denied specific acts of sabotage. He was clearly trying to confess enough to protect his family while preserving some shred of dignity. It didn't work. 18 were executed, including Bukharin. His wife was sent to the Gulag for 8 years. His infant son was placed in an orphanage for children of enemies of the people. The show trials were theatrical, public, designed for international consumption, but they were just the visible tip of the purge. The real killing happened in secret, in systematic mass operations that turned Soviet security organs into execution factories. Order number 00447 on July 30th, 1937, Stalin issued order number 00447, marking the beginning of the mass operations. This wasn't targeting specific individuals suspected of crimes. This was quotas. Regional NKVD offices were given numerical targets for arrests and executions. For example, Moscow, 5,000 executions, 30,000 labor camp sentences. Leningrad, 4,000 executions, 10,000 labor camp sentences. Ukraine, 8,000 executions, 20,000 labor camp sentences. These weren't based on intelligence about conspiracies. They were arbitrary numbers. Stalin and the NKVD leadership simply decided how many enemies each region should have, then ordered local offices to find them. And if you didn't meet your quota, you were suspected of insufficient vigilance, which could make you the next target. So regional NKVD officers enthusiastically exceeded their quotas, arresting anyone they could classify as an enemy. The target categories Order 00447 specified who qualified as enemies of the people. Former kulaks, wealthy peasants who'd resisted collectivization, former members of opposition parties, former White Army members from the Civil War, religious clergy, socially harmful elements, a category so vague it could mean anyone. But in practice, the categories expanded to include anyone who'd traveled abroad, anyone with relatives abroad, anyone who'd been arrested and released, obviously still suspicious, anyone denounced by neighbors, anyone randomly selected to fill quotas. The arrests followed a pattern. NKVD officers would arrive at night, arrest the target, search their home, then take them to prison. Families weren't told where their relatives had been taken or what they were charged with. Many never saw them again. The Troika's trials became impossible. There were too many prisoners. So Stalin created Troikas, 3-person tribunals consisting of local NKVD chief, prosecutor, and party secretary. Troikas met in secret, reviewed cases for minutes, sometimes seconds, and passed sentences. 2 options: execution or 10 years in the Gulag. There was no defense attorney, no witness testimony, no appeals. In 1937 to 38, Troikas processed approximately 1.5 million cases. They averaged hundreds of cases per day, spending less than a minute on each. This wasn't justice. This was bureaucratized slaughter. The execution grounds NKVD execution facilities operated around the clock. In Moscow, the primary site was the Butovo firing range. In Leningrad, it was Levashovo. In Kiev, Bykivnia. The procedure was standardized. Prisoners were taken from cells in small groups, told they were being transferred, led to a room, shot in the back of the head, then dumped into mass graves. The graves were covered with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. As one site filled, another was opened. Bodies were stacked in layers, thousands per pit. The executioners were NKVD officers doing this as their regular job. They'd arrive for work, shoot people for hours, file paperwork, then go home to their families. Later testimony from executioners reveals the psychological toll. Many turned to alcohol. Some had mental breakdowns. A few were themselves arrested and executed in later purges, Stalin eliminating witnesses to his crimes. The most strategically catastrophic aspect of the Great Purge was the decimation of the Red Army. The Marshal's Trial. In June 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant military commanders, was arrested along with 7 other senior generals. They were charged with being German and Japanese spies plotting military defeat. The evidence was fabricated documents provided by Nazi intelligence, who understood that Stalin's paranoia could be weaponized. Stalin accepted the forgeries as real, possibly knowing they were fake but not caring, because Tukhachevsky was popular and independent-minded. After a one-day closed trial, all 8 were executed. This triggered a cascade of military arrest. The statistics of self-destruction. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin purged the Red Army. 3 out of 5 marshals executed, 13 out of 15 army commanders executed, 8 out of 9 admirals executed, 50 out of 57 corps commanders executed, 154 out of 186 division commanders executed, all 11 deputy commissars of defense executed. In total, approximately 40,000 military officers were arrested. About half were executed, the rest sent to the Gulag. The Soviet military lost 90% of its generals, 80% of its colonels, countless experienced officers at every level. The impact was catastrophic. When Nazi Germany invaded in June 1941, the Red Army was led by inexperienced officers promoted rapidly to fill the gaps left by the Purge. The initial Soviet defeats, the Wehrmacht's stunning advance in 1941-42, can be directly traced to the military purge. Stalin had so feared a military coup that he'd destroyed his own army's leadership. Then, when real war came, he discovered he'd eliminated the very people who could have defended the Soviet Union. The confession of Marshal Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky's confession is particularly revealing. After torture, he signed a document admitting to being a German spy since 1925. The document is preserved in Soviet archives, and it's covered with Tukhachevsky's blood, literally. He was beaten so severely during interrogation that his blood splattered onto the confession as he signed it. This is what confession meant in Stalin's purge. Not truth, but submission. Not evidence of guilt, but proof of the state's power to destroy anyone. Behind the statistics were millions of individual tragedies. Families destroyed, lives shattered, children orphaned. The knock in the night. Soviet citizens in 1937-38 lived in constant terror of the knock on the door. The NKVD always came at night, usually between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. when people were asleep and disoriented. Families developed rituals, sleeping in clothes in case of arrest, keeping small bags packed with essentials, saying careful goodbyes before bed in case someone didn't return. Children were trained not to cry when parents were arrested. Tears could suggest the family believed the arrest was unjust, which made them suspicious. The waves of arrests. The purge created cascading arrests. If you were arrested, your family became suspect. Your friends became suspect. Your coworkers became suspect. Anyone associated with you was now potentially tainted. Wives of enemies of the people were automatically sent to the Gulag for 8 years, guilty by marriage. Children over 15 could be arrested as well. Younger children were sent to special orphanages for children of traitors. This created a perverse incentive. Denounce your arrested relative to prove you're not complicit. Soviet newspapers published letters from wives denouncing their arrested husbands, children denouncing parents, friends denouncing friends. The society was turned inside out. Trust became impossible. Silence became survival. The Gulag expansion. Those who weren't executed were sent to the Gulag, the vast network of forced labor camps stretching across Siberia and the Arctic. The Gulag population exploded during the Purge. 1935, approximately 950,000 prisoners. 1938, approximately 1.9 million prisoners. 1939, approximately 2.5 million prisoners. These weren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They were teachers who'd been denounced by jealous colleagues. engineers who'd failed to meet impossible production quotas, workers who'd arrived late to their jobs too many times, party members who'd expressed doubt about policies. Conditions in the camps were designed to kill slowly. Prisoners worked in logging, mining, construction, brutal physical labor in Siberian winters with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Death rates in some camps reached 30% annually. Many prisoners never learned what they had been convicted of. Their sentences were simply 10 years without right of correspondence, a euphemism that often meant execution but kept families hoping their relatives were alive somewhere. In November 1938, Stalin suddenly stopped the purge, not because he'd had a change of heart, not because the conspiracy had been defeated, but because the purge had begun to threaten Stalin's own control. Why it ended? Several factors converged. First, the economy was suffering. Too many engineers, managers, and skilled workers had been arrested. Factories couldn't meet production quotas. Infrastructure projects were delayed. The purge was damaging the Soviet industrial capacity. Second, the military weakness had become undeniable. The Red Army's performance in border clashes with Japan in 1938 was poor. Stalin recognized he'd crippled his own military. Third, the NKVD itself had become unstable. The organization that had conducted the purge was now consuming itself. NKVD officers were being arrested by their colleagues. The system was eating itself. Stalin needed to restore control, so he blamed everything on the NKVD. The scapegoating of Yezhov. Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD during the worst of the purge, was arrested in April 1939. He was charged with being a foreign spy, a wrecker, and an enemy of the people, the same charges he'd used against millions of others. The message was clear. The purge had gone too far, and it was all Yezhov's fault. Stalin was the wise leader who had now corrected the mistakes of overzealous subordinates. Yezhov was executed in February 1940. His deputy, Lavrenti Beria, took over the NKVD and implemented a new policy: fewer arrests, more emphasis on forced labor rather than execution. But the damage was done. The statistical toll. Modern historians using Soviet archives opened after 1991 have established approximate numbers: 1.5 to 1.7 million arrested in 1937 to 38, 681,692 executed, confirmed from death certificates, approximately 1 million sent to the Gulag, additional deaths from conditions in camps, estimated 200,000 to 300,000 total dead from the Great Purge, approximately 1 million people in 2 years. For context, that's roughly the same number of American soldiers who died in all American wars combined from the Revolution through Vietnam. Except these were Soviet citizens killed by their own government in peacetime. The Great Purge raises a fundamental question: why did Stalin do this? The paranoia theory. The most common explanation is Stalin's personal paranoia. He genuinely believed in vast conspiracies. He saw enemies everywhere. His psychology, shaped by decades of revolutionary conspiracy and political warfare, made him incapable of trusting anyone. This is partially true. Stalin was genuinely paranoid. But paranoia alone doesn't explain the systematic nature of the purge, the quotas, the bureaucratic organization, the power consolidation theory. A second explanation is that Stalin used the purge to consolidate absolute power. By eliminating all old Bolsheviks, all independent-minded leaders, all potential rivals, he created a party entirely dependent on him. This is also partially true. The purge did centralize power, but it did so at enormous cost, weakening the military, disrupting the economy, traumatizing the population. The totalitarian logic theory. The deepest explanation is that the purge revealed the logic of totalitarianism itself. Totalitarian systems require absolute conformity, but absolute conformity is impossible. People have private thoughts, doubt, reservations. So the system must constantly police not just actions, but thoughts. And since thoughts can't be directly observed, the system must rely on confessions. But real conspiracies are rare. So the system manufactures them through torture, quotas, and incentivized denunciations. The purge becomes permanent because there's no point at which the system can declare victory over hidden enemies. This is the totalitarian paradox. The more successful the regime is at eliminating enemies, the more paranoid it becomes about remaining enemies, leading to ever-expanding purges. The Great Purge wasn't an aberration. It was totalitarianism working as designed. In 1961, 23 years after the purge ended and 8 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev stood before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party and denounced Stalin's crimes in a secret speech that shocked the world. Khrushchev revealed the scale of the purge, the false confessions, the torture, the arbitrary arrests. He called it the cult of personality and blamed Stalin personally. But here's what Khrushchev didn't address: the system itself, the Communist Party structure that had enabled the purge, the ideology that justified it, the millions of ordinary Soviet citizens who'd participated, the interrogators, the executioners, the denouncers, the people who'd looked away. The Great Purge wasn't just Stalin. It was a system that turned fear into policy, denunciation into duty, and murder into bureaucratic routine. The universal warning. What makes the Great Purge relevant today isn't its communist ideology. It's the mechanism. A system that demands absolute loyalty, that sees dissent as treason, that creates quotas for finding enemies, that rewards denunciation. These mechanisms can exist in any political system. The specifics change, the language, the justifications, the targets, but the pattern remains. Identify an enemy, expand the definition of enemy, incentivize finding more enemies, systematize their elimination. We see echoes in modern authoritarianism. Regimes that demand public confessions, that arrest people to meet quotas, that create systems where citizens surveil each other, where trust becomes impossible, where silence becomes survival. The Great Purge teaches us that you don't need gas chambers or concentration camps to commit mass murder. You just need a bureaucracy, quotas, and a population too afraid to resist.